On the night of my wife's graduation dinner, which I had paid for, she chose to humiliate me by calling me the husband with no future. But what she couldn't have imagined was that that toast would be the last one before I showed her that she would never laugh at my expense again. My name is Ethan Caruso. The night of my wife's graduation was supposed to be a perfect closing chapter after years of hard work, and I was the one who had arranged every detail. I paid for everything without complaint because I wanted Alexandra, my partner of 5 years, to have the celebration she deserved. She had overcome one of the most demanding stages of her academic life, and I was proud of her achievement. For 3 weeks, I planned the dinner at the Green Marlin, a restaurant so extravagant that even the bread rolls came with a backstory. It was the kind of place where a glass of water felt like a personal favor and paying for parking was equivalent to mortgaging a kidney. But it was her day, and I wanted her to shine. Besides booking the private room, I coordinated every seating detail with her mother, Eleanor, who treated any event as if it were a diplomatic gala. I verified the reservation 3 times to ensure there were no mistakes. I sent invitations, confirmed timings, and even dealt with an issue that, honestly, should have already tipped me off that I was going too far. Her parents showed up with 2 blazers that looked like they had survived a hurricane, and Victor, her father, asked me to work my magic. I, like a good simpleton, spent almost an hour watching tutorials on how to properly iron a lapel, just so they would look good in the photos of a daughter who barely spoke to me. The dinner began amid forced conversations with people who hadn't taken 2 minutes to ask what I did for a living. Among them were Alexandra's classmates, a group of future lawyers dressed as if they had just stepped off a Swiss watch commercial, all with the same rehearsed laugh that smelled of money. They toasted to grandiose concepts like justice and democracy, though they would likely forget it all as soon as they landed their first corporate jobs. Her professors also attended. Professor Benedict, one of the most celebrated, spent his time reciting legal theories in a tone so pedantic he seemed to be competing with himself. And Professor Chandra was no different. It was as if they were speaking to each other in a dialect designed only to make themselves sound intellectual. Meanwhile, I wore my suit, bought on sale, a perfectly functional but unassuming one. I watched Alexandra converse with everyone, radiant in an emerald green dress that easily cost more than my truck's monthly payment. Her hairstyle, supposedly casual, surely required an hour of professional styling. She moved with a confidence and grace that, at one point, made me feel we were a team. That thought lasted until she decided to stand up. The room gradually fell silent. People watched her expectantly, convinced she would thank her family, her professors, her colleagues, and perhaps, I naively thought, me. I remembered when she first came to my office years ago. I was still working at Caruso, Renovation and Consulting, and she was asking for help to recover damaged files from her thesis. That smile she wore that night was the same one that had knocked me down. Then she raised her glass, cleared her throat, and said, "I want to take a moment to acknowledge my husband, Ethan Caruso." I felt a small spark of optimism mixed with a difficult-to-explain premonition. She continued speaking in front of everyone. "He has been with me through every crisis, every sleepless night, every complicated stage. He always supported me emotionally." She paused. I knew something was coming. "Emotionally," she repeated, and her smile changed. "Because intellectually, well, we all know that's not his strong suit." Several people let out a chuckle. I took a deep breath. No degree, no plan, living off my future salary and fixing things around the house, she finished with a laugh that spread through the entire room. But hey, what successful woman doesn't need a good handyman? The burst of laughter was immediate. Stacy Chandra, her inseparable friend, almost spat out her wine. Professor Benedict applauded as if witnessing a comedic monologue. Victor leaned back, roaring with laughter, and Eleanor looked at me with a triumphant expression that had been years in the making. Even the young waiter briefly joined in before correcting himself. While everyone enjoyed the show, I kept my smile, but inside, something shifted into a very different place. It wasn't a breaking point, it was a revelation. For 5 years, I had been unknowingly financing other people's right to mock me. I thought of every tuition fee paid, every extra shift I'd worked, every sacrifice I'd made so Alexandra could dedicate herself 100% to her studies. All of it to end up as a joke, and not even a good one. When the laughter finally died down, I slowly rose. All eyes returned to me, expecting me to take it with humor or play along like a good, submissive husband. But no more. I raised my glass, looked directly at her, and with a calmness that even surprised me, I said, "Enjoy it, Alexandra. That's the last joke you'll make at my expense." I put the glass on the table, adjusted my jacket, and walked out of the room without shouting, without hitting anything, without giving melodramatic speeches. I just left, conscious for the first time in years that loyalty without respect is not love, it's voluntarily becoming someone's doormat. I crossed the main hall without looking back, passing the stunned faces, the table that had suddenly fallen silent, and the host who watched me with concern, as if fearing something worse was about to happen. I didn't say a word, I just kept walking until I reached the parking lot, where the night air hit me with a mix of lucidity and rage, as if I had suddenly awakened from an overly long dream. I leaned against my truck, my hands still trembling, unsure if it was from adrenaline, contained fury, or an unexpected sense of relief. I took out my phone and jotted down 4 rules that would be my mantra from that moment on. Never respond on impulse, document absolutely everything, protect my peace, and protect my work. I read them twice, took a deep breath, and let the night wind fill my lungs. It smelled of freedom mixed with indignation, of an ending and also a beginning. And for the first time in 5 years, I felt like the protagonist of my own story again. But to understand how I reached that point, I have to go back to the origin because every catastrophe has its first crack. In my case, it started in a place as unromantic as it was practical, the University Campus Tech Support Center, where I worked extra shifts to add money to my construction company. It was a Tuesday in September, a suffocating afternoon where the air conditioning had already lost the battle against the heat. I had spent 3 hours repeating to freshmen that turning the computer off and on fixed 80% of the problems. Then Alexandra Ricci appeared, carrying her laptop as if it were a bomb about to explode. She rushed in like a whirlwind, her hair loose from a makeshift bun, and her mascara slightly smudged, a sign that she had been crying or rubbing her face for too long. Probably both. "Please, tell me you can save this," she said, her voice cracking with anxiety and urgency. "My thesis is corrupted, and I present in 3 hours. If I lose that file, I'll fall apart right here." I wasn't there out of IT vocation. My real job was running Caruso Renovation and Consulting, a company I founded right after high school, while all my classmates were preparing university applications or drowning in student loans. While they debated philosophy at parties and experimented with fraternities, I learned to read blueprints, coordinate subcontractors, and deliver projects that yielded real profits. The shift at the university was easy extra income, nothing more. I took Alexandra's laptop, ran recovery software, and managed to save about 90% of her document. While I worked, she paced back and forth, thanking me one second and saying her academic legal life was about to crumble the next. "You're saving me," she repeated over and over with a strange mix of relief and despair. When I handed the computer back with most of the file recovered, she looked at me as if I had rescued a puppy from a fire. "I owe you a coffee, dinner, whatever," she said. I laughed and told her a coffee was fine, thinking it would be the typical thank you that never materialized. But Alexandra didn't let it go. The following week, she showed up with a homemade cake that was supposedly a family recipe. She later confessed she'd found it on Pinterest and baked it at 2 a.m. From that day on, she started dropping by my office just to talk. She was fascinated by my construction work. She touched my calloused hands and said, "I love that you build real things. Everyone here talks, theorizes, dreams, but you turn ideas into structures people can use." I was 24, running my own business, and yet I felt lucky that a brilliant, attractive, and ambitious law student wanted to spend time with me in my tiny office smelling of old coffee. She told me about her classes, her internships, her dream of becoming a civil rights lawyer and changing the world. I listened, captivated, feeling that together we were building something bigger than either of our professions. 8 months later, I proposed. Everyone said it was too fast, but I've always been direct about important decisions. When you know, or so I thought. I proposed to her in a Victorian house I was restoring in the historic district. The wind of the sunset blew through the windows as I showed her the recovered original floors and the details of the handcrafted moldings. I told her how I wanted to build a life with her with the same dedication I used to renovate a home. Solid foundations, serious planning, and the intention that everything would last for generations. She cried. She said yes, and I believed I was the luckiest man on the planet. We married while she was in her second year of law school, and I was chaining up successful commercial projects. Without openly saying it, we agreed that I would be the financial support while she completed her degree. Her goals involved transforming the world with legal reforms. Mine, literally building it, creating the spaces where those changed lives would exist. For a time, it felt like a perfect alliance. We talked late into the night about our plans. She dreamed of opening a practice to defend the disadvantaged. I wanted to expand my company into sustainable construction methods. We were, at least in theory, a powerful team. But gradually, without an exact date, the narrative changed. I began to fade. I stopped being Ethan Caruso, partner and pillar, to become Alexandra's husband. And that metamorphosis began with minimal details. At every law school event, people enthusiastically approached her to greet her, ignoring me as if I were a nameless accessory. "And you are?" they would ask with a look that made it clear they needed a justification for my presence. I didn't know it then, but that was the first of many warnings. Being Alexandra Ricci's husband had become a kind of supporting role in a play where I barely featured. Every time she introduced me, she did so with a phrase that, while sounding kind, always functioned as a key that opened the same door of indifference. "This is my husband, Ethan Caruso." And then everything followed its usual course: courteous smiles, polite nods, and within seconds, conversations revolved exclusively around her again. No one asked what I did. No one showed the slightest interest in knowing that I managed important projects, that I had a company that guaranteed stable work for 15 people and generated six-figure annual revenue. In the eyes of her circle, I wasn't worth much because I didn't cite court rulings or carry a lawyer's briefcase. It was as if my existence dissolved among them. The worst were her classmates, a group of young people who were brilliant, yes, but also arrogant, full of academic pride, convinced that educational level determined a person's worth. They all dressed as if they shared the same expensive brand wardrobe and repeated the same philosophy that a university degree was the center of identity. When they came to our apartment, the one I paid for entirely, they settled into the furniture as if it were theirs, drank the wine I bought, and held endless conversations about cases, professors, and exams without even including me, except to assign me tasks. "Ethan, can you bring more ice? Ethan, do you have a charger somewhere? Ethan, can you turn down the game? We're talking about important things." I became a kind of silent assistant, a human piece of furniture with a built-in debit card. At first, Alexandra spoke proudly of my work. She told everyone about the historical restoration projects I carried out, about the effort I put into my business, almost making it sound like an admirable artisan profession. But as she advanced in her career, her tone changed. The introductions began to shrink. "This is Ethan, my husband." Nothing more. No additional context, no acknowledgement. And if someone asked what I did, she answered before me. "He has a small construction company," said with that emphasis that reduced my multi-million-dollar projects to simple improvised houses in a garage. During those years, I worked tirelessly. 12-hour days amidst cement dust and sawdust, arriving home with destroyed clothes, taking a quick shower before preparing dinner because Alexandra always had a night class, study group, or important activity. I paid her tuition without protesting, even when our savings fund was almost empty from her books and bar exam prep courses. There were days when I survived on cheap coffee and vending machine food because I didn't even have time for lunch. Meanwhile, she collected recognitions. She made academic publications, won competitions, and secured a prestigious firm position where she earned almost nothing, but which polished her resume with a golden sheen. Everyone celebrated her achievements, her parents, her friends, her professors. And my contributions? No one seemed to see them. Eleanor, her mother, was especially skilled at making clear what she thought of me. Every time she visited our home, she scanned the space with the critical eye of someone evaluating a low-category hotel. "Are you still with the construction, Ethan?" she asked as if speaking of a childish hobby. "Surely when Alexandra advances further in her career, you'll have a chance to look for something better." The translation was evident. "When my daughter no longer needs your money, maybe you can do something worthwhile." Victor, her father, was no slouch either. He patted my back with that condescending air typical of a retired lawyer who believes the world is classified by hierarchy. "You do good work, son," he said while his gaze evaluated every corner. "My Alexandra deserves celebrations that match her stature." I still believed we were a team. I thought my sacrifices were part of a common project, that building a future meant that sometimes one person gave more than the other and that this would balance out over time. I kept telling myself that she valued my effort, even if she didn't show it. I didn't grasp the truth until much later. The academic world had already convinced her that she was more and I was less, that a university degree outweighed any achievement obtained through manual labor, that supporting her emotionally was fine, but not being able to match her intellectual level made me inferior. And when I understood it, I had already spent 5 years acting as an extra in my own life. The graduation celebration dinner was at the Green Marlin, a place where your bank account seemed to weep as soon as you crossed the entrance. Marble floors shining like mirrors, lamps that looked like works of art, and staff who moved with the elegance of a 5-star hotel. The hostess who received me was the very image of a magazine ad. Impeccable, perfect, professional. "Mr. Caruso, your private room is ready. Everything is as you requested." I had spent $2,000 on that dinner. $2,000 I could have invested in new tools, a small trip, or anything more productive than feeding the people who would, minutes later, humiliate me. But I still lived under the illusion that romantic gestures kept a marriage together, even if only one of us cared about it. I had paid for the premium package, filet mignon with lobster tail, wines so expensive they needed a poetic explanation before serving, and a chocolate dessert that, according to the menu, promised a celestial experience. The private room was beautiful, soft lighting, dark wood panels, and large windows overlooking the harbor, where sailboats looked like luxury toys floating at the whim of the wind. The first to arrive were, inevitably, Alexandra's parents. Eleanor treated punctuality like a competitive sport. She entered 15 minutes early, walking with her collection of pearls that could fund an entire microeconomy. Victor came with a blazer ironed to the millimeter, radiating that vibe of a retired partner from a powerful firm. "Ethan," Eleanor said while making a feigned greeting without touching my skin, lest she ruin her makeup. "It's a lovely spot, although I must admit we were surprised you didn't choose the harbor view. We celebrated Victor's retirement there, and the service was impeccable." Translation: "This is fine, but we know a better place, and we want you to know it." Victor shook my hand with the measured force of the typical lawyer who needs to make clear who dominates the room. He checked every detail of the table setting, the arrangement, the decoration, as if assessing whether my expense had been worthy enough of his daughter. "Good job with all this, son," he finally said. And that was possibly the closest thing to a compliment I had received from him. "Alexandra is going to be delighted. She deserves a night like this after so much effort." I nodded, not imagining that that very night would mark the beginning of the end. The most striking thing about the entire evening was that among so many speeches and congratulations, there was not a single mention of my effort, nor of the fact that I was the one who financially supported Alexandra's studies while she pursued her career. But I suppose I was already used to being the silent ATM at every social event. The first guests began to arrive around 6:30. From my seat, watching them enter was like witnessing a perfectly rehearsed parade. Everyone seemed to have received the same instruction on how to dress as if they were about to execute a legal seizure. The men wore suits whose price easily exceeded my monthly mortgage payment, and the women sported that polished style of expensive haircuts, striking jewelry, and heels so sharp they could be considered weapons. They greeted each other with exaggerated hugs, inside jokes, and witty remarks about professors or recent cases, grouping into small circles that almost seemed to have an invisible sign that read, "Access restricted, manual laborers not admitted." Among them appeared Stacy Chandra, Alexandra's best friend and classmate, who made it clear from day one that she didn't like me. She was one of those people with a sharp mind, a fast pace, and firm opinions on every imaginable topic, from commercial law to table etiquette. She passed by me with a strained smile and, "Hello, Ethan," and immediately rushed to Alexandra to tell her a story that ended in roaring laughter. Then came Marcus Bentley, the guy who had competed with Alexandra for the best grades during the first year until they finally made peace and became close. Tall, impeccable, with a handshake so calculated that one felt assessed in 2 seconds. "You must be proud, mate," he told me. I nodded because what else could I do? Proud, yes, but also tired. And starting to feel like the event employee instead of the husband of the honoree. The professors made their appearance with the typical delay of those who believe the world begins when they arrive. Among them was Professor Benedict, a silver-bearded man who taught constitutional law and seemed to enjoy the cult of his person. He was already on his 3rd drink and, surrounded by students, dramatically explained some recent court ruling as if he were delivering a divine sentence. Professor Chandra, unrelated to Stacy, also attended. Small, strict, with a reputation for being tougher than a piece of iron. Most students were deeply intimidated by her, but Alexandra had managed to earn her respect. There she was, evaluating the venue with an approving gesture, as if I had passed an exam I didn't even know I was taking. During the cocktail hour, I moved back and forth, smiling, serving drinks, pointing out where the restrooms were, making sure everyone was comfortable. I looked like a butler disguised in an expensive suit at a celebration I had paid for myself. No one asked me about my job or my life. I barely received 1 or 2 superficial comments about the beauty of the room. One guy, I think his name was Leo or maybe Jack, he was so irrelevant I barely remember him, told me with a wink, "It must be great to have a wife who's going to be earning fortunes soon." The joke would have been funny if it weren't for the fact that I had actually financed every step of that career. Once seated for dinner, Alexandra, gorgeous in her emerald dress, squeezed my hand under the table and whispered thanks. "Thank you for organizing all this. It's perfect." And I believed her. I truly thought she meant it. They served a seemingly sophisticated salad with edible flowers that tasted like grass, and everyone reacted with exaggerated exclamations as if they were facing a culinary masterpiece. The conversation flowed around me without including me. Job offers, exams, internships, nothing I could contribute to. When the main course arrived, I must admit the fillet was impeccable, tender and juicy. For a moment, I relaxed. I thought perhaps the night would go well, that maybe I was exaggerating, that Alexandra did value what I had done and that this was simply her chance to shine. Couples, after all, take turns. One supports, the other advances. You don't keep score. But then Professor Benedict tapped his glass with a fork and announced a toast. With that commanding tone so characteristic of him, he congratulated the graduates for overcoming 3 years of effort. Everyone raised their glasses and toasted. So far, so normal. It was when Alexandra stood up that I felt a strange knot in my stomach. Something in her smile, in the way she held the glass, alerted me. The room fell silent because everyone wanted to hear the talented future lawyer, Alexandra Ricci. "Thank you all for being here," she began. "This has been an incredible journey, and I wouldn't have reached the end without the support of some extraordinary people." She gestured to her parents, her friends, her professors, and finally looked at me. I, naive, imagined this would be the moment she acknowledged my sacrifices, the tuition I paid, the sleepless nights, the years prioritizing her dreams over mine. "But I want to give a special thank you to my husband, Ethan," she continued. All eyes turned to me. The man who was with me through every crisis, every sleepless night, every professional doubt. So far, everything seemed correct, but then something shifted in her expression, and with a clear, almost theatrical laugh, she added, "He supported me emotionally, though not so much intellectually, because let's be honest." Muffled laughter rose, anticipating what was coming. No degree, no plan, living off my future salary and fixing things around the house. But hey, what would a successful woman be without a good handyman by her side? The explosion of laughter was immediate, a direct punch to the gut. Stacy spat out wine from laughing. Marcus shook his head amidst giggles. Professor Benedict applauded, celebrating as if he had heard the punchline of the century. Victor smiled proudly, and Eleanor wore that satisfied smirk of someone who has been thinking the exact same thing for years. Even the young waiter, no older than 22, let out a smile before composing himself. And I simply stayed there, motionless, absorbing the blow as if my dignity hadn't just been dismantled in public. The entire room was laughing at me, enjoying the impromptu joke that had formed around my presence in Alexandra's life. And she, the woman for whom I had worked, given up, and risked everything, smiled as if she had just won her first great professional triumph. I remained seated, the champagne glass halfway to my lips, struggling to maintain an expression that looked cordial and relaxed, even though inside I felt my face turning into a rigid mask designed to hide a shock I still hadn't fully processed. It was as if my mind worked in two dimensions. One part perfectly understood what had just happened, and the other refused to accept it, like a calculation gone wrong, an equation impossible to fit into human logic. I had chosen this woman. I had built my life around her, and suddenly, she was turning me into a joke, a side character, a man useful only to adorn the success story she told about herself. When the laughter finally subsided, I felt the decision was already made. I drove to Leo's apartment without music, strange for me, because I always need noise, a voice, a podcast, any sound to keep my mind from sinking into its own echo. But that night, I couldn't tolerate any more stimuli. I needed silence, absolute silence, to confront what had just happened, to let the shame sink into my bones like a toxic substance that, if it existed, could cause emotional cancer years from now. The downtown streets were unusually quiet for a Saturday, just a few college students staggering between bars and a couple of homeless people sheltered near the transit station. My truck grumbled at every traffic light, and the red reflection on the hood spread like a perfect metaphor for the burning I carried inside. Everything, even the streetlights, seemed inflamed, saturated with the same rage I felt. Leo Martinez had been my best friend since high school when we were both too young and arrogant, convinced we could conquer the world armed only with ambition and terrible haircuts. I had launched myself into construction, while Leo pursued his love for cooking and now managed a food truck called Taco Fury, famous for serving Korean-Mexican fusion that had a loyal following among the working people in the area. For him, emotional support consisted of offering extra food without asking too many questions, a trait that made him the ideal person to take refuge with when your life began to fall apart. He lived in a converted loft inside an old warehouse in the Arts District, a place full of exposed brick walls and visible pipes that, in his case, conveyed a certain bohemian charm rather than disorder. He probably paid an absurd rent, but the space had personality and a full kitchen, which was the only truly indispensable thing for him. From the parking lot, I sent him a message. "Are you home? Need to crash here." Long story. The ellipses appeared right away. "Doors open. There's beer and leftover bulgogi. Come up." That was Leo. No dramatic interrogations, no demanding quick explanations, just an open door and food ready. I grabbed my phone and my wallet. I had left the rest in the apartment I shared with Alexandra, because I left without planning an extended stay, almost as if I had escaped a fire. I climbed the metal stairs leading to the second floor, and before I could knock, Leo was already opening the door. He looked at me for just a second and muttered, "This is serious, isn't it?" He wore his usual off-work attire, worn shorts and a faded t-shirt from a concert we had attended in 2019. His dark hair was messed up in 7 different directions, a sign that he had probably fallen asleep on the couch. His look could intimidate anyone due to his short, sturdy build and permanent 5 o'clock shadow, but when he smiled, it was clear he was really a friendly bear who just knew how to use a knife well. "It's worse than you think," I said as I walked in. Worse on a historical level. Emotional Titanic sinking. I collapsed onto his old leather sofa, a piece of furniture he had bought at an estate sale and defended by saying it had character, which really meant it accumulated stains of questionable origin and an indefinable odor. But after the elegant perfection of the Green Marlin restaurant, that dilapidated sofa was surprisingly comforting. Leo returned from the kitchen barely a minute later with 2 beers and a pizza box that he placed on the table with the solemnity of a priest presenting a sacred relic. "Talk," he ordered, settling into his armchair and propping his feet up on a recycled milk crate used as a footrest. "What happened? Did someone die? Did your truck finally give up? Or did we discover Alexandra really was a Russian spy, like I always said?" Despite everything, I laughed. I opened the beer, took a long drink, and then began to recount everything that had happened. I explained how I organized the dinner, how I ended up ironing her parents' matching blazers as if I were a domestic assistant, how I chose the expensive restaurant and the costly wine, believing I was doing something special for my wife. And then, when I got to the toast, I saw the full evolution on Leo's face. First curiosity, then incredulity, then an anger so intense it looked like something inside him had ignited. "She said that," he interrupted when I reached the decisive part. "No degree, no plan, living off her salary? Dude, you've been paying her tuition for 5 years. You're the one who supported her all this time. What salary is she talking about if she doesn't have one yet? She's the one who's been living off your effort for years." I nodded. Hearing someone else say out loud the same thing I was thinking made everything crystal clear, almost painfully so. It was no longer just my perception, it was reality. "And everyone laughed," I continued. "Her parents, her classmates, her professors. For them, I was the buffoon at the table, the ornament allowed to be there just to be part of the joke." Leo opened the pizza box, pepperoni with jalapeno, my favorite, and handed me a slice with that brusque but affectionate style he uses when he's too outraged to express direct compassion. "Damn," he said, shaking his head slowly. "You married a TED Talk in heels." I couldn't help but genuinely laugh. The most sincere laugh I'd let out since leaving the restaurant. "A TED Talk in heels." "Yeah," I admitted. "That's exactly her." "I bet she even has a PowerPoint presentation," Leo added, with graphs demonstrating her greatness and pie charts explaining why her husband is basically an appliance with limited functions. He took a huge bite of his slice, chewed in silence for a moment, and then pointed at me with the crust. "And what did you say? Please tell me you responded. Don't tell me you just sat there swallowing it all." I took a deep breath. I told her to enjoy the moment because it would be the last time she made a joke at my expense. Then I stood up, adjusted my jacket, and walked out without shouting, without making a scene. I just left. Leo let out a long, cold whistle. "I'm proud of you. Most guys would have exploded or just endured it. You did the emotional equivalent of flipping the bird with elegance. Well done." He took another slice and settled down more calmly. "So, what's next? Are you going back tonight? Tomorrow? We're entering divorce territory, or is this just a monumental fight?" I stared at my phone. "I'm not sure yet," I admitted. Asterisk, but I'm going to do something I should have done years ago. I'm going to document everything." I opened a new note on my phone and started typing while Leo watched me intently. Every tuition payment, every loan I co-signed, every double shift I worked for years so Alexandra could focus on her studies. I prepared every dinner, handled every errand, and absorbed every sacrifice that she now apparently considered insignificant. As I began to organize my thoughts, the list of everything I had contributed emerged with surprising ease. It was clear I had been keeping that tally in my mind without realizing it. Fall 2020, $8,500 to cover her first semester. Spring 2021, another $8,500 plus $2,200 for books and academic materials. Summer 2021, all living expenses borne by me, rent, utilities, food, while she took an unpaid internship. The figures piled up one after the other, a kind of financial history of sacrifice I never imagined reviewing, but which suddenly proved indispensable to acknowledge. "Holy cow," Leo mumbled, leaning over to see my screen. "That's a lot of money. Money for a new car, a down payment on a house, an early retirement." He took out his phone and started typing. "I'm not letting you sink with this. I'm ordering food because disasters are always processed better with carbs. Tell me what you want and don't say no, Because I swear I'll fight you. Crab rangoon, I replied automatically while continuing to type. And those onion pancakes. I opened my phone gallery and started reviewing the photographs of receipts I had saved for taxes, clear proof of how much I had invested in Alexandra's education and upkeep. Among them was the bookstore receipt where I spent $800 on her constitutional law and criminal procedure books. Also, the payment confirmation for her bar exam prep course, $3,200 charged to my card, which took me half a year to pay off. I found the proof of the $25,000 student loan, for which I had to be the co-signer because neither her parents wanted to help her nor did she qualify a loan. Every document was another brick in the wall of evidence I was building, proving that I wasn't exaggerating or imagining my contributions. They had been there all along. I also found emails where she asked me to cover her expenses because she was too busy studying to keep the legal assistant job she held for barely a semester. Text messages in which she thanked me for supporting her, promising that everything would get better when she graduated and started working. Screenshots of our joint account clearly showing deposits from my company and withdrawals almost exclusively for her obligations. A unilateral flow that apparently gave her the right to publicly mock me as if I were a kept man. You know what's most absurd? I said to Leo, looking up from the phone. I never thought I was keeping score. I thought we were building a project together, that she was investing in her future, I was supporting that effort, and eventually, we would both enjoy the benefits. That's how a marriage is supposed to work, right? You support her dreams, she supports yours. Sure, Leo replied, but being publicly humiliated shouldn't be included in the deal. His phone vibrated. Perfect. Food arrives in 20 minutes. Finish that list in the meantime. Then we'll sit down and plan your next steps, and you can stay on my couch as long as you need. I spent the next hour meticulously performing what amounted to a financial autopsy of my marriage. 5 years of paying tuition, covering basic expenses, supporting her unpaid internships, buying her professional clothes, because apparently, dressing like a lawyer costs almost as much as becoming one. The final total exceeded $17,000. That was the investment I had made in a relationship that Alexandra apparently interpreted as a kind of charity work. When the food arrived, Leo spread it out on the table as if setting up an impromptu feast. The crab rangoon was perfect, crispy outside, creamy inside, exactly what my soul needed. The onion pancakes were hot, flaky, and had that comforting greasiness only Asian food can provide. As we ate in silence, I felt the emotional weight on my shoulders begin to loosen a bit. Here's what I think, Leo said, wiping his hands. Tomorrow, you go back to the apartment when you know she's not there. Pack the essentials, clothes, toiletries, important documents. Bring everything here temporarily. Then, you call a lawyer and start assessing your options. You don't have to decide today if you're getting divorced, or tomorrow, or next week. But you do have to protect yourself. He was right. I needed to think strategically, not from the wound. I needed to act intelligently, document everything, and base my decisions on facts, not emotions. I woke up the next day on his couch with a strained neck, a headache mixing dehydration and existential crisis, and that lucidity that only comes after reliving a public humiliation too many times in one night. The light streamed in through Leo's industrial windows with a brightness that seemed designed to torture a hungover eye. From the kitchen, I heard him maneuvering among pots. He was surely channeling his stress into some recipe that would turn out delicious or setting the stove on fire. The smell of coffee and bacon, however, convinced me to get up. You look a mess, he said with his usual good humor, sliding some breakfast tacos in front of me. But that's the smell of revenge, which is a major upgrade. What's the plan? He was already ready for work in his Taco Fury shirt and cap turned backward, surprisingly awake for having been up with me until 2 a.m. compiling evidence of my crumbling married life. I need a lawyer, I said, my voice still rough. Do you know a good one? The irony was obvious, asking for a lawyer 5 years after financing one's degree. But we were in the real world, where the person who should defend you is sometimes the one who stabs you. Leo pulled out his phone. Yeah. Remember my cousin, Marissa, who divorced that tech guy who tried to take her food truck? claiming it was shared assets even though she'd created it before meeting him. I nodded, vaguely recalling the drama. She hired a lawyer named Grace Belucci. According to Marissa, she legally dismantled the ex-husband until he was dust. Super expensive, but worth every penny. Send me the number. A second later, Leo sent me the contact accompanied by a message, "Go get him, Tiger." I called right there in his kitchen, expecting to find a receptionist who would schedule me for 2 months from now. Instead, a woman answered with a rough, deep, almost raspy voice, like whiskey mixed with years of experience, who introduced herself as Grace Belucci and asked what I needed in a tone that made it clear she didn't waste time, but invested it in interesting cases. My wife publicly humiliated me at her graduation dinner. I explained after mentioning I had spent 5 years financing her law degree. I saw no reason to beat around the bush, so I got straight to the point. I need to know exactly what my chances are from a legal standpoint and if there's any way to seek compensation after having financed practically her entire career while she treated me like hired help. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, followed by a soft laugh with a hint of amusement and something predatory. "I like you already, Mr. Caruso," the lawyer replied. "Be in my office at 11. If you have documents, bring them. If not, no big deal. We'll figure out what's needed. My rate is $350 an hour for the initial consultation. If you decide to hire me, we'll discuss a payment plan. Sound good?" That $350 was roughly what I charged for a full day of construction consulting, but something told me it would be worth it. "I'll be there," I replied. She dictated an address in the financial district and hung up without the usual courtesy most people use to close a call. And to my surprise, I didn't mind. In fact, I started to like it. Grace Belucci's office occupied the 14th floor of a glass tower that seemed designed to intimidate from the sidewalk. The lobby, filled with marble, metallic surfaces, and modern furniture as expensive as it was uncomfortable, conveyed the feeling of being in a place where only perfection was tolerated. The elevator livened up the ride with soft music that, honestly, awakened in me the need to commit some minor property crime. Upon reaching the indicated floor, a minimalist and clearly expensive reception area greeted me as if it were part of a ritual to test that one didn't entirely belong. The receptionist, a young man with impeccable hair whose ID badge read David, quickly examined me, assessing whether I could afford to be there. "Mr. Caruso?" he asked. I nodded. "Ms. Belucci is ready for you. Second door on the left. Would you like coffee, water, or anything else?" "I'm fine, thanks." I followed his directions down a hallway with abstract paintings that, honestly, could have been works of art or color samples from a paint store. I had no way of distinguishing. I knocked on the second door, heard a firm, "Come in," and entered. The office, with a massive dark wood desk that seemed to have a history of its own, clearly belonged to someone who had won many important arguments. Grace Belucci, perhaps in her 40s, stood up to greet me with the grace of someone who practices a demanding and perhaps slightly violent physical activity. She wore a charcoal gray suit that cost, without exaggeration, more than a month of my mortgage. Her gaze, direct and precise, gave the feeling that she could read my thoughts and judge whether I was worth continuing to listen to. She was beautiful, but in that intimidating way that explains why some ancient cultures worshipped warrior goddesses. "Ethan Caruso," she said, shaking my hand with a firmness capable of cracking nuts. "Sit down and tell me everything from the beginning. Don't omit anything. Even if it seems embarrassing or silly, I promise you, I've heard worse." I took a seat and started from the beginning. How I met Alexandra, how I supported her law studies, my financial sacrifices, and finally, the disaster of the toast at her graduation dinner that ended with me sleeping on my best friend's couch. Grace didn't interrupt once. Occasionally, she made notes with calligraphy so perfect it looked carved. Everything was normal until I mentioned Alexandra's toast. Grace raised her hand to stop me. "I want to understand this clearly," she said with professional calm. "You covered all the expenses of her legal education. How much was that exactly?" I gave her the figure I had calculated the night before. Her eyebrow arched. "So, you paid roughly $17,000 between tuition, expenses, upkeep, and support during her unpaid internships. And yet she chose to publicly present you as her charity case in front of colleagues, professors, and family. That's correct. Yes, that's what happened. Just repeating it stirred an uncomfortable mix of shame and rage in me. And to top it off, everyone laughed as if it were a brilliant joke, as if I had lived off her salary when, in reality, she hadn't generated income in 5 years, and everything had come from my work. Grace leaned back in her chair with a slow smile, so sharp that any shark would have felt intimidated. "Congratulations, Mr. Caruso," she said with a mockingly kind tone. "You have just graduated with honors from the University of the Naive Husband. Welcome to the real world, where love doesn't fix everything, and sometimes the person you choose turns out to be a narcissist with a law degree. But don't worry, her educational phase is over. Now we go for the refund." I laughed because the irony was starting to take effect. I had dedicated 5 years to someone who apparently only saw me as an ATM with basic emotional skills. Now I was sitting in front of a lawyer trying to climb out of the rubble. "So, what do I do?" I asked. "What are my options?" She took another sheet of paper and wrote as she spoke. "First, we document absolutely everything. Tuition payments, rent, purchases, bills. I need bank statements, receipts, emails, text messages, anything that proves the financial imbalance. Then, we review your assets, define what is joint and what is individual, and determine if we are looking at a divorce with the possibility of claiming reimbursement or simply a very expensive life lesson." She looked up and pierced me with her direct gaze. "I'm going to call this a strategic disengagement. It sounds better than saying leaving a parasitic relationship where you acted as a human credit card. We will treat it methodically, professionally, and with enough documentation to make an IRS auditor cry with emotion. And when we're done, your wife will understand that publicly humiliating the man who financed her success is the kind of strategic mistake they should teach in law school." We spent the next hour reviewing everything I had brought. Grace asked precise questions, noted down more data, and sometimes muttered things like, "Unbelievable," or "What nerve." When we finished, she looked at me with something that might have been respect. "The essential thing is this," she said. "Don't seek revenge. Revenge is emotional and fleeting. Ours will be something else. Proof, records, evidence. Revenge fades. Documents never do. We are going to gather every piece of proof of your contribution to that relationship and use that material to ensure you receive fair treatment in whatever comes next." As I left, she walked me to the door and handed me her card. "Don't seek revenge, Mr. Caruso," she repeated with a smile so precise it could have made a surgical incision. "Seek receipts." I always believed that words could hit harder than anything else. They leave longer-lasting and deeper cuts. It was the best advice I had ever received, and at that moment, I decided to apply it to the letter. So, I spent the following week acting like a man possessed, not by ghosts, but by receipts, bank statements, and the painful confirmation that I had financed my own emotional ruin for over 5 years. Leo's couch became my makeshift camp, and his coffee table was transformed into something resembling the world's most depressing vision board project. Piles of documents, highlighted printouts, sticky notes filled with increasingly sarcastic comments, and an absurd number of empty coffee cups reflecting how much I now depended on caffeine. Every time Leo came home from working on his food truck, he would look at my wall of evidence and throw out comments like, "You look like a detective from a crime show, only sadder and with worse lighting." And yes, he wasn't wrong. I started by reviewing the bank statements. I printed 5 full years of transactions from our joint account and my business account. As I reviewed, patterns began to emerge, like those optical illusion posters that initially look like junk until suddenly a hidden sailboat appears. In my case, what appeared was the certainty that I had been feeding a financial black hole disguised as a marriage. Month after month, always the same thing. Deposits from Caruso Renovation and Consulting, money I earned through hard work on job sites and client projects, followed by immediate withdrawals to cover tuition, books, rent, and everything related to Alexandra. Seeing it was like watching a financial vampire drinking from my accounts in real time, with the difference that vampires, at least, are honest about what they do. There were months when I deposited $6,000, and 2 weeks later the balance dropped to ridiculous figures because studying law apparently required books made of gold leaf and human tears. The tuition payments were the worst to review, not just because of the amount, but because they evidenced my largest contribution to her career. Fall 2020, $8,500 to State University Law School, paid with a check from Ethan Caruso. Spring 2021, another $8,500. Summer, $1,200 for an accelerated constitutional law course that Alexandra swore was indispensable for her career. Every semester, every payment, all coming from my accounts or in my name. Her contribution was always between 0 and I'll pay you back when I'm a lawyer. Spoiler, that promise aged worse than milk in midsummer. Then came the lease agreements, a journey through memories I would have preferred to forget. We moved 3 times during her student years. First, because the original apartment didn't have enough natural light for studying. Then, because the second one was too far from campus, and by the 3rd year, she was convinced she needed a more luxurious place downtown to project success to potential employers. In every single one, I was listed as the primary tenant, my income as the key requirement, my signature accepting all responsibility. She was there too, yes, but always listed as a student or with that legal assistant job she held for only 4 months before deciding it interfered with her studies. The receipt file was another mountain to climb, and apparently, the Ethan of the past had been so meticulous about saving documents for tax purposes that he unknowingly built the perfect file for understanding how he had financed his own marital disaster. There I found the law school bookstore receipt, $470 for second-year books, from criminal procedure to evidence and something called torts, which I swore was a dessert but was apparently about lawsuits. Then there were the bills for professional clothing, 3 suits, for blouses, $1,200 so Alexandra would have appropriate attire for mock trial competitions. I saw it as an investment in our future. Today, I understood it as the purchase of the perfect costume for the play where I played the role of the buffoon. And then I found the receipt for the graduation ring. That very ring she had worn proudly at that disastrous dinner, the one engraved with the law school crest and her graduation year, paid for with my card for $650. The jeweler had even written a note, "Congratulations on your achievement." A cosmic joke, considering the true achievement had been financed by the same man she had just humiliated in public. I laughed. A strange, slightly shaky laugh that made Leo come out of his room with a concerned expression. "Everything all right, dude?" "Yeah," I told him between laughs. "I just found the receipt for the graduation ring I bought her to celebrate the degree I also paid for. Perfectly normal, right?" Every document came with automatic sarcasm from my brain. When I found the bill for the bar exam prep course, charged to my card, I placed a sticky note that read, "And here I also financed her professional license." What a generous soul I am. The contract for the luxury apartment with its $2,400 monthly rent was labeled, "Projecting Success. Monthly cost equals 1 martyr." The receipts for expensive meals to avoid interrupting her study hours were tagged as, "Feeding the future lawyer who will one day say I have no plan." $4,200 of irony. But the hardest blow came on the 5th day of that financial archaeology. While reviewing transfers from our joint account, I followed the movements to see where the money went once deposited. That's when I noticed a pattern, regular, not huge, but constant transfers of $200 or $300 toward an account number I didn't recognize. I cross-referenced that number with our records. Nothing. That account was not joint, nor did it appear in any shared document. It was something entirely different. Called the bank. After 20 minutes of listening to elevator music capable of inspiring tax crimes, someone finally answered. They confirmed what I feared. There were periodic transfers from our account to an external savings account. They couldn't give me additional information without authorization, but they could confirm that all those transfers had been initiated by Alexandra Ricci using her online credentials. And that's when I truly understood everything. Something had been unsettling me for some time, a kind of silent pressure that settled at the back of my neck every time I checked our accounts. A premonition I couldn't quite identify, but that insisted on staying. It was a minor detail, almost imperceptible, the kind of thing anyone would overlook, except a person used to squaring numbers after working double shifts for years. I'm referring to small transfers Alexandra made from our joint account to a fund that, according to her, simply didn't exist. It wasn't a scandalous figure in each movement, but it was constant and discreet enough to arouse suspicion. Over time, I realized that this money, which came directly from my salary, my extra hours, my sacrificed weekends, had been leaking for 2 years into a secret savings account to which only she had access. When I sat down one night with my laptop and totaled all the transactions, the final figure reached approximately $6,800. It wasn't a fortune capable of changing the course of the world, but it was significant enough to cover a complete move to another apartment, hire a top-tier lawyer, or prepare any escape strategy she might have been planning while still sleeping in the bed with me. It was an emergency fund, but not ours. It was hers, and she had built it behind my back. The worst part wasn't the money, but what it meant. While I worked double shifts to help her achieve her academic goals, she was surgically setting up an exit route funded by my efforts. She wasn't just preparing an alternative, she was building an economic life raft with materials I paid for myself, all while maintaining the appearance of a stable, functional, and cooperative marriage. I admit that looking at it from a cold, almost clinical angle, her audacity was even impressive. She had played her hand with a confidence that only comes from the conviction that one will never be discovered. I decided to act calmly. I gathered every document, printed copies, reviewed bank statements one by one, categorized receipts, and organized everything into folders so meticulous that any librarian would feel a lump in their throat with pride. I spent 2 nights creating a chronological file detailing every suspicious transfer, which day it occurred, from which device, and to which account it had gone. I left no stone unturned. When I finished, I had 3 boxes full of solid, coherent, and impossible-to-deny evidence. With that accounting arsenal, I scheduled a second meeting with my lawyer, Grace Belucci. When I arrived at her office carrying the 3 boxes, her assistant, David, looked at me as if witnessing the birth of a legendary case. "Dr. Belucci will appreciate this level of preparation," he commented as he helped me arrange the boxes on a side table. When Grace entered and opened the first folder, she let out a brief, completely sincere laugh. The kind of laugh someone makes when they find a diamond where they expected coal. "Mr. Caruso," she said, flipping through the documentation with a mixture of enthusiasm and genuine astonishment. "This is better organized than several entire cases at my firm. Everything is here: financial evidence, payment history, receipts, transactions. You've built a practically airtight case. It proves that your wife laid the foundation for her future legal career using your assets without consulting you. It's impeccable. It's beautiful. It's the kind of material that makes opposing lawyers weep while reviewing their $4 coffee that tastes of defeat." We spent 2 hours reviewing everything point by point. Grace made quick notes while murmuring phrases like, "Unbelievable," "the absolute nerve," or my favorite, "This isn't clumsiness, this is premeditation with arrogance." Every phrase that came out of her mouth reinforced the feeling that I wasn't exaggerating, that what I had discovered was more serious than I had wanted to admit. When we reached the section on transfers to the secret fund, Grace set her pen on the table, intertwined her fingers, and looked at me with a mixture of respect, professional indignation, and genuine astonishment. "Here you have something crucial," she said. "She didn't just move money without your consent, she was building an escape fund using shared resources. This is financial manipulation, a breach of trust, and clear evidence of premeditation. In a trial, this carries a lot of weight, a lot." I left the office with a firm legal plan and, for the first time in a long time, a sense of real direction. I had spent years in a state of silent resignation without realizing it. That afternoon, I knew I was finally regaining control over my own life. That night, sitting in my friend Leo Martinez's apartment, I opened my laptop and drafted an email that needed no embellishments. It required no emotionality, no dramatic speeches, and no convoluted explanations. I simply wrote 3 clear, direct lines. Attached is a financial record that reflects the true cost of your career. Consider this a courtesy copy before my lawyer submits the official one. Regards, Ethan. Nothing more. No emojis, no threats, no pleas, just facts. I attached a PDF with a precise summary of all the material Grace and I had examined, an organized document that was impossible to reinterpret or gloss over. After reviewing it one last time, I pressed send before doubt could cling to me. I poured a drink, raised my glass to Leo, who was watching me from the kitchen counter, and said, "To the receipts, may they always be clear and definitive." Leo raised his beer with exaggerated solemnity. "To the receipts," he repeated, and to finally stop confusing loyalty with foolishness. Exactly 28 minutes later, my phone began to ring. Alexandra's name lit up the screen like an unpleasantly familiar beacon. I stared at it for a few seconds, frozen between curiosity and anticipation, until Leo approached, saw the screen, and said, "Answer on speakerphone. I have to hear this." I took a deep breath, accepted the call, and placed the phone on the table. "Ethan." Alexandra's voice trembled with indignation and an ill-concealed fear. "Tell me you're not serious. That email? What's going through your head to send me something like that? And with attachments? Do you know how unprofessional that is?" I remained silent for a few seconds. Leo's eyes were wide, awaiting my reply. "Do you really think I'm exaggerating, Alexandra?" I asked in the most neutral voice I could muster. "A few days ago, you stood up in front of your colleagues, your professors, and your parents and decided to turn me into a joke. You mocked me as if I were part of the entertainment. That's a lack of respect. The only thing I did was show the financial reality behind that joke." "But everyone was laughing," she replied, genuinely bewildered. "It was just a joke. I can't believe you're so sensitive. You can't take everything so literally." "That's precisely the problem," I replied. "Everyone thought it was funny that you presented me as a kept man with no degree or goals, as if I had lived off your salary, the same salary I supported for 5 years by working double shifts. I just verified your joke with data and discovered that the real naive one was me for believing we were a team." She tried to defend herself, talking about perceptions, misunderstandings, and tones, but I had already crossed a point from which I wasn't going back. "Listen," I interrupted her. "I'm not going to discuss this now. You'll talk to my lawyer. Have a good night, counsel." I hung up. Leo doubled over with laughter, hitting the table as he tried to catch his breath. "Dude," he said between giggles. "You told her, 'Have a good night, counsel'?" That was like dismissing someone with an elegant verbal slap. Legendary. He poured 2 more beers and added, "I bet $10 she calls you again in less than an hour." But she didn't call. That silence was more unsettling than any emotional outburst. I lay down on Leo's couch, wondering if I had been too harsh, if I should have allowed her to give her side, but I cut that thought short. I had spent 5 years justifying behaviors that wore me down. I knew that if I gave in right now, I would repeat the same cycle again. The next morning, while enjoying the burrito Leo had prepared, the man cooked under stress as if he were a monk practicing Zen meditation with tortillas and eggs. My phone rang again, and this time it wasn't Alexandra. The number that appeared on my screen was unknown, though with a local area code. I thought it might be a client or a vendor, so I answered without overthinking it. What I didn't expect was a voice marked by years of exclusive club memberships and overly expensive whiskey bottles. "Mr. Caruso, this is Richard Thorne. I'm a senior partner at Thorne, Bishop and Associates, the firm where your wife, where Alexandra Ricci will be starting as a junior associate." His tone implied he anticipated some kind of reaction from me, but I remained silent. I learned long ago that when you say nothing, the other person usually feels compelled to fill the gaps. And it worked. "I'm calling you because the situation created by your wife's comments at the graduation dinner has reached our ears. We would like to discuss how to resolve this matter discreetly." I nearly choked on my burrito. Then I understood what had happened. The email I sent, detailing the years of financial abuse I tolerated, had leaked from Alexandra's inbox to the partners at her new job. Now the firm's lawyers wanted to talk to me personally, and not just any lawyer, one of the most senior. Lawyers enjoy other people's drama as if it were professional fuel, and apparently, my documents had caused a small internal fire. This exceeded any scenario I had imagined. "Mr. Thorne," I replied, trying to sound professional, even though I was in a sweatshirt on my best friend's couch. I appreciate the call, but I don't understand what there is to discuss. I only sent my wife financial documentation about our marriage. If that caused complications in her new job, it seems the conversation should be with her, not me. There was a pause on the line. I could almost hear him recalculating his strategy. Mr. Caruso, we are aware of the incident at the dinner. Several of our lawyers were present, and what happened has been widely discussed, especially after reviewing the financial documentation you shared. There are concerns about professionalism and judgment that we need to address before Ms. Ricci's start date. Would you be willing to meet with our Human Resources Department and me? We can make sure your time is worth your while. Worth your while. Unmistakable code for, we are willing to pay for this to disappear before it becomes a bigger scandal. I told him I would consult with my lawyer and respond later. I hung up and immediately called Grace Belucci, who answered on the second ring, excessively alert for 8:30 a.m. Grace Belucci, she greeted, typing something simultaneously. What can I do for you, Mr. Caruso? A senior partner from Alexandra's new job called me, one named Richard Thorne. Apparently, the email I sent circulated throughout the firm. They want a discreet meeting, and he used the phrase, make it worth your while, which I interpret as an invitation to accept money to stay silent. The sound of the keyboard stopped immediately. Richard Thorne contacted you personally? She asked with a new energy, like a shark sensing blood in the water. This is perfect. They're worried about the firm's reputation. They're likely afraid that hiring someone who publicly humiliated her husband will affect their image. When do they want to meet? We agreed to see them 2 days later at the firm's main offices. That buffer gave Grace time to prepare what she called the good folder, a detailed dossier of all my financial contributions to Alexandra's career, accompanied by summaries, graphs, and legal references that would make any partner nervous. We go in calm, professional, and with a touch of boredom, she instructed me over the phone. You wear your best suit. I'll do 90% of the talking. You don't apologize for anything. Understood? Understood, I said, and spent the next 2 days mentally preparing to face the same legal machine that had molded my wife. Leo Martinez helped by distracting me with increasingly elaborate meals and comments about my files. You're like Batman, he told me the night before while preparing fish tacos. But instead of fighting crime, you fight disrespect with receipts. You're the crusader of the invoices, the dark knight of documentation. That's the most absurd thing you've ever said, I replied, smiling despite myself. The morning of the meeting, I put on my best suit, the charcoal gray one I reserve for demanding clients who want assurance that their contractor, the owner of Caruso Renovation and Consulting, doesn't look fresh off a construction site. I met Grace in the firm building's lobby. She was impeccable, as if she had been born with a briefcase under her arm. She was carrying the famous leather folder, the good folder. Ready? She asked. I nodded. Remember, she added as we walked towards the elevators. Calm, professionalism, and a touch of indifference. We are not here to beg. We are here to negotiate from a position of strength. The offices were exactly what I imagined of a prestigious firm. Intimidating art, outrageously expensive furniture, and enough mahogany to have outraged an entire nature reserve. Richard Thorne received us in a conference room with windows overlooking the entire city. We were literally above everything, in altitude and pretense. He had the look one expects of a veteran lawyer, impeccable suit, silver hair, and a handshake calculated to communicate absolute dominance. Mr. Caruso, Ms. Belucci, thank you for coming, he said, offering us seats. Would you like coffee, water? Grace placed her briefcase on the table. The sound was soft, but I would have sworn it intimidated the air. Caffeine softens me, she replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I prefer we get straight to the matter. She opened the folder and pulled out a document that she slid toward him. Thorne began to read, and I watched his expression evolve from absolute confidence to barely contained discomfort. I was witnessing that moment when a lawyer discovers he doesn't have the cards he thought he did. The silence in the room morphed into that tension preceding a declaration of war or a very expensive settlement. Finally, he put down the document, adjusted his glasses, and spoke in a measured tone. Ms. Belucci, these requests are broad. Here you are asking for a total financial reimbursement, a formal letter of acknowledgment, restrictions on Ms. Ricci's public statements, and, he turned to the second page, mandatory professionalism training for the entire firm using this incident as a case study. That's a rather exhaustive list. The game had clearly just begun. Grace leaned back in her chair with that measured gesture only professionals who know the terrain by heart possess. It wasn't simple confidence. It was the certainty of someone who knows the situation is entirely tilted in their favor and that the other party is only just beginning to grasp the magnitude of the problem. From my seat, I could see how she evaluated every detail. Richard's posture, the tension in his jaw, nothing escaped her trained eye. "I will explain it clearly, Mr. Thorne," she began, modulating her voice with that firmness that doesn't need to be loud to be forceful. If we don't reach an agreement today, my client's full report, with 5 years of detailed financial documentation proving how he economically sustained his wife's legal career while she treated him practically as personal staff, will be filed with the family court. And as you well know, those files are publicly accessible. She uttered the last phrase slowly, as if to allow each word to sink in with surgical precision. Then she paused briefly, visibly calculating the time for the weight of that warning to land deeply. "The press loves David versus Goliath stories," she continued, crossing her hands on the table, "especially when Goliath turns out to be a recent law graduate who chose to publicly humiliate the man who paid for every stage of her professional training. Can you imagine the headlines, Mr. Thorne? Junior associate's husband demands refund for financing her education, or perhaps law graduate sued by man who paid for everything while she ascended. The media would be thrilled with the implications: financial abuse, emotional manipulation, toxic dynamics in professional couples. I can already see the morning shows inviting psychologists to debate this case." Richard's jaw barely twitched, a sign that he was beginning to understand the scope of the scenario that would open up if he decided to insist on a confrontation. Though I must admit he maintained his composure with more discipline than I expected. Even under pressure, his breathing remained slow and controlled, an indication that he was accustomed to complex situations. Next to him, Diana Walsh watched everything with a seriousness that seemed chiseled. I knew her only by name, but her reputation within the firm was that of a woman with minimal tolerance for mistakes and an almost surgical ability to deactivate conflicts before they exploded. Until that moment, she had remained silent, observing, measuring, absorbing information. She finally intervened, leaning forward. "Mr. Caruso," she said in a professional, almost conciliatory tone, "we understand you are hurt and angry. What happened at that dinner was unacceptable and unprofessional. No one is denying that. But you must also consider that a public dispute would negatively affect everyone, you, Ms. Ricci, and, of course, the firm. Cases like this draw attention in unpredictable ways." I tried to respond, but Grace gently placed her hand on my arm. It was a clear, direct signal. "Do not intervene, I've got this." I immediately complied. "Ms. Walsh," Grace responded without losing her composure, "my client is not worried about his public reputation. What he wants is fair treatment after 5 years during which he was subjected to financial exploitation and emotional exhaustion that you cannot begin to quantify. And frankly, the only reputation at risk here is that of your future junior associate, who deemed it appropriate to ridicule her husband at a public event while enjoying the financial support he provided without reservation." It was then that she opened her briefcase. I recognized the document as soon as she pulled it out. It was the summary we had worked on for weeks, organized with meticulous precision. It was impossible to ignore what it said. Every figure matched dates, receipts, emails, and transfers. Grace slid the document toward them with the serenity of someone who knows they are placing their strongest card on the table. "Here is a complete breakdown of Mr. Caruso's financial contributions to Ms. Ricci's education, upkeep, and professional development over 5 years. It includes university tuition, rent, daily expenses, bar exam fees, study materials, transportation, and, of course, the graduation ring she was wearing when she made that joke at the dinner. The total amounts to $17,000, without considering the extra hours he worked to cover those costs or the emotional toll of supporting a partner who never acknowledged the effort being made for her. Richard took the document and began reviewing it. I watched him frown as he flipped page after page, becoming more concentrated, less sure of his position. Next to him, Diana leaned over to look, and her expression noticeably changed when she reached the secret funds section. The transfers Alexandra had been moving from our joint account to a private account for 2 years. That point had surprised even Grace because it evidenced planning, not carelessness. "And we are not finished yet," Grace added, placing her phone on the table with a tap that sounded louder than necessary. "We have multiple witnesses willing to testify word for word about what Ms. Ricci said that night, and several of them work right here in this building. I have already spoken informally with some, and they confirmed the general content, that my client had no education or plan and was living off her salary. Absolutely false and defamatory statements, moreover said in a professional setting full of people who might take them as true coming from a future lawyer." I saw Richard stare at the ceiling for a moment, as if gathering all his self-control not to let out a sigh of frustration. It was clear he was weighing the costs, the economic price of a private settlement versus the reputational damage of a public trial, the internal impact on the firm versus the almost certain promise that the story would leak to the media. Lawyers can argue, negotiate, object, but at the end of the day, they always return to the same axis, cost-benefit. And at that moment, Grace was brutally presenting them with the clarity that fighting us would be a battle they couldn't win without paying a disproportionately high price. Finally, Richard slowly stood up, as if the movement weighed on him. "Let's take a 15-minute recess," he said, trying to maintain formality, though tension seeped into every word. "Ms. Walsh and I need to deliberate privately. Can you help yourselves to something in the meantime?" He gestured toward a side table filled with fresh coffee, water bottles, and a tray of pastries that looked straight out of a European bakery, delicate and unnecessarily expensive. When they left the room, I turned to Grace, trying to read her expression. "How do you think this is going?" I asked in a low voice, though Richard's hard stare as he left had already given me the answer long before I formulated the question. Grace simply narrowed her eyes with a slight smile, the kind that surely leads more than one opposing lawyer to question their career decisions. Grace Belucci was so sure of herself that she didn't even try to hide it. She took out her phone, checked some messages, and declared with total conviction, "They are going to accept the settlement." Richard Thorne is not naive. He knows perfectly well that airing something like this publicly would be a disaster for the firm. Right now, they must be discussing how to handle the damage internally, perhaps assessing whether they should retract the job offer to Alexandra Ricci or keep her on with some kind of strict supervision. Whatever path they choose, we will leave here with what we came for. And she was right. 20 minutes later, far from the mere 15 Thorne had promised, Richard and Diana Walsh returned to the room. As soon as they entered, I noticed the change. Thorne no longer had the defensive attitude with which he had started the meeting. His posture, his breathing, and even the way he arranged his hands on the table revealed resignation, like someone accepting a decision they don't like but acknowledge as inevitable. "We are prepared to propose a settlement," he announced, his voice controlled. I felt my pulse quicken. "Full reimbursement of the documented expenses. We will have to verify each amount, but according to what was presented, the figure is approximately $17,000. Furthermore, we will draft a formal letter acknowledging Mr. Ethan Caruso's financial contributions to Ms. Alexandra Ricci's education, a document that can be used in any future legal proceeding. We will also include a confidentiality clause to prevent Ms. Ricci from making public statements about Mr. Caruso regarding either their marriage or his professional life." "And the mandatory professionalism training?" Grace interjected, leaving nothing out. Thorne paled slightly but nodded. "Yes, we will implement a mandatory program for all associates and junior partners with a case study based on," he paused as if the words burned his tongue, "this incident. It will emphasize the importance of maintaining appropriate professional boundaries and avoiding any comment that could be interpreted as defamatory or harmful to personal relationships." Grace smiled. It was the smile that had surely led more than one opposing lawyer to question their career decisions. Perfect. My office can draft the agreement this afternoon. If everything progresses smoothly, we could have it signed before the end of the week. She stood up and I followed suit. I shook Thorne's hand with an enthusiasm that frankly exceeded professional standards. As we rode the elevator down to the lobby, Grace looked at me with an expression that mixed triumph and compassion. Congratulations, Mr. Caruso. You have just secured an extremely expensive divorce settlement without even getting divorced. Although, if you allow me a personal opinion, after what you've been through, I would file for separation anyway. That woman is going to hate you for the rest of her life. That sounds perfect to me, I replied. And I meant it. Let her hate me, but from a distance and with a legal document prohibiting her from mentioning me. When we stepped outside, the sun hit me with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. I took a deep breath. Grace, thank you truly. I couldn't have faced this alone. She extended her hand for a formal shake. That's what we're here for, and believe me, you'll be fine, better than fine. You will build a life that doesn't depend on anyone's approval, and it will be extraordinary. Now go celebrate with your taco friend. I'll call you when the paperwork is ready. I did exactly that. I returned to Leo Martinez's apartment. I told him everything, and we ordered enough food to feed a platoon. For the first time in a very long time, I had the real feeling that things were starting to settle. 6 months later, I transformed the pain into an unexpected opportunity. I founded Caruso Renovation and Consulting, a peculiar mix of construction management and personal coaching for those who had lost the ability to build something valuable, including their own self-esteem. My first consulting clients were 3 lawyers from Alexandra's own firm. Yes, the same ones who had heard my story and were seeking advice to protect their assets before their marriages went the same route as mine. The irony tasted delicious every time I sent an invoice. My new apartment was small, but 100% mine. I chose every piece of furniture, every detail, and for the first time, I felt I was living in a place that reflected who I was, not who I was trying to impress. The refrigerator was full of real food, not leftover boxes. My mood had also changed. It went from bitter to sharp and bright. Leo started calling me the contractor of the comeback, which was definitely an improvement over the guy who was ridiculed at the dinner. One day, Alexandra sent an email with the subject line, "Maybe we should talk." I replied with exactly 7 words. My rate is $200 an hour. Legal counsel aside. She never responded. And that told me everything I needed to know about how much value that conversation held for her. There are dialogues that simply don't deserve to be opened, especially with people who only acknowledge you when it suits them. A year later, I found myself in front of a full auditorium, standing on the main stage of a seminar dedicated to men seeking to regain stability after emotionally draining relationships. I held a glass of water in my hands, more as a tool to control my nerves than as part of the event, and watched the silent crowd adjust their seats, waiting for my intervention to begin. The topic assigned to me was direct: how to stop living as someone else's unfinished project and start building your own. The fact that a guy who worked in remodeling and personal reconstruction consulting was there explaining how to restore life from the foundations caused a few knowing smiles even before I spoke the first word. My ex-wife used to introduce me as a man with no direction. I began, letting the phrase settle. The ironic thing is that my true direction appeared when I learned to let go of what couldn't be fixed. The reaction was immediate, a murmur of recognition. Some contained laughter, nodding heads. This time it wasn't a joke disguised as humor, but a gesture of identification. When my intervention ended, several people came up to talk. Some wanted a handshake, others sought to share their stories, and still others simply thanked me for hearing someone put into words what they were still trying to organize. One woman commented that her husband had sent her one of my videos weeks ago and that they had both managed to understand each other better after watching it. That surprised me more than I let on and gave me a satisfaction that no financial settlement could have equaled. Later, back in my workshop, surrounded by the smell of wood and the quiet echo of a space where everything was in its place, I poured a drink and raised it without needing to toast anyone. I thought of that night at the Green Marlin, the way I had been ridiculed, and how that very moment had marked the beginning of a completely different path from the one I expected. I didn't say anything out loud. This time, I didn't need to. The simple fact of remaining there at peace, in control of my decisions, with no excuses to give and no permission to ask, was sufficient proof that I was no longer living in anyone's shadow. I had stopped being the easy target of other people's jokes. I had learned to support myself, and what I was building now, a life where respect was a foundation and dignity was non-negotiable, was worth much more than anything I had lost along the way.